Okay, well, thank you, John.
No problem.
And thank you to Mr. Stephen Shore and all of those at Real Truth About Health. Thank you for this opportunity to speak and to share some of my thoughts and concerns. I only wish I could see you. It's kind of hard talking to a empty slate, but I hope to hear from you later in this presentation. To those who are practicing and celebrating the religious holidays of this month, Ramadan, Passover, Easter, I too recognize the importance of having faith, especially in times of war and social discord. And to everyone who may be listening, I thank you for taking the time. So the question, is the U.S. failing women? This is actually not my question. This question was the title to a commentary that was written by 3 authors in Australia. They had reviewed an article looking at the pregnancy risk and pregnancy complications for women in the US over a 30-year period from 1989 to 2018. And they saw that the risk factors and the complications were increasing. And their question was, unless something is done about it, then the US clearly is failing women. So I like to talk about that a little bit because as it turns out, this week, April 11th through April 17th is Black Maternal Health Week. And we'll get into that a little bit later in the slide. All right, so a picture is worth 1,000 words. This is a representation of the maternal mortality rates in a number of countries taken from approximately 2018. And we should start by defining what is a maternal mortality ratio. Basically, it is the number of maternal deaths per 100,000 live births. And these deaths can occur during the pregnancy or within 42 days of the termination of the pregnancy, not due to an accident or an incidental cause. For example, if a pregnant woman were to die as a result of a car accident, that would not be considered a maternal death per se. But if she died as a result of preeclampsia or toxemia of pregnancy, then that would be included in this number. As I stated before, Black Maternal Health Week was first recognized by the White House last year in 2021, and I will talk about why that is so important in a little bit. But just looking at this graph, we see that when the United States is compared to other developed countries, we see that we're outstanding. We're outstanding in the fact that we have the highest maternal mortality rate of developed countries. And this is just a consideration. This is looking at something that's slightly different. It's looking at the number of weeks of paid maternity leave in a number of countries. And again, what's striking is that the United States is outstanding in that we don't have a national paid maternity leave policy. Maternity leave is either provided by the state or individual employers. And the reality is that a substantial number of women who are employed do not get paid maternity leave. And then just to look at the other extreme, in a place such as Norway, where there are 91 weeks of paid maternity leave, this doesn't mean that she is getting 100% for 91 weeks. She's getting some sort of pay. It's usually a small percentage as the time goes by, reduced eventually to something about 30% of what her pay would be if she chooses to extend it beyond a certain period of time. The point being that even though it is not equivalent to what she might be making, at least she's getting some sort of financial subsidy, some sort of help while she's caring for her newborn. Speaking of work, we need to recognize that at least in the US, women are actually in the workforce. Our numbers almost approximate that of men. And you can see that this phenomena is relatively new. If you look at this particular graph, it shows you that the increase in female labor force really didn't start to go up until the second half of the 20th century. And then this is a breakdown according to race and ethnicity. And the women that are most prominent in the female labor force are Black women, which is interesting because we know from other statistics that women do not make as much as men as a general rule. It's said that for every dollar a man earns, a woman earns about 83 cents. And for a Black woman, that's even less. That's closer to 60-some cents. And this is important as we tie it back into maternal morbidity and mortality. And that's what I'm going to try to do as we go along. This is taking a closer look at the US maternal mortality rate over 3-year periods, beginning with 2018, ending 2019. 2018, this is the overall 17.4 maternal deaths per 100,000 live births. 2018, 2019, and you can see the rate is going up. The color bars show you based on race. And what's again outstanding is that Black women, non-Hispanic Black women, have a rate that's multiple times that of white, non-Hispanic white women. I live in Philadelphia. Philadelphia is a large city, about 1.6 million persons. And in Philadelphia in 2018, instead of having MMR of 17.4, our rate was 20 maternal deaths per 100 live births. When they looked at etiology for that, almost half, 46% of these maternal deaths were due to cardiomyopathies or problem with the heart or the vascular system. It showed that in Philadelphia, non-Hispanic Black women made up 43% of the births. However, they accounted for 73% of the pregnancy-related deaths. This striking disparity is part of the reason why people are becoming acutely aware that there is a problem, because it doesn't appear to be limited to socioeconomics. A college-educated Black woman has a higher risk of maternal mortality than a non-Hispanic white woman who has graduated high school. So there is no obvious explanation for this. And because of that, it's drawn a lot of attention. And we recognize that there are problems that have either yet to be identified, clearly identified, or they're problems that we are just not addressing. Now, before I go on, I have to say that this slide is lacking in the fact that it doesn't show the maternal mortality rate for Asian women. And we know that Asian American women, Pacific Islanders are the fastest growing racial group in the United States. And I'm torn between which is worse, to have the worst statistics or to not be mentioned at all. And I kind of side towards the worst statistics, because from the limited information that we do have, we see that the maternal mortality rate for Asian American women is not significantly higher than what you might see for non-Hispanic whites, although the reasons may differ. And so again, this is just another area where we need to recognize that there are healthcare disparities, not only involving African American women, but Asian women, Native American women, and we need to evaluate all. The reason that I am focusing on non-Hispanic Black women is because the disparity is so large. And of course, I am a Black woman and I have an intimate interest in learning why. I need to say on a personal note that just last week, a young woman was in the office and she said that she wanted to get pregnant, but she wasn't ready to die. And I thought that was such a sad statement. And I should also say that this was not a Black woman. This was an Asian woman saying that she had fear concerning becoming pregnancy and actually had a real fear about dying, which just tells me that there's work to be done. We clearly need to do more. Now, this is the part that's really good news and shocking all at the same time, because despite our, large disparities, despite the fact that we have the highest incidence of maternal mortality of the developed countries, the CDC has stated that 66% of these deaths are preventable. And I don't know if that's something we should be happy about or something that we should be ashamed of, because if we could prevent 66% of the deaths, then why aren't we? Why isn't something being done? And so the CDC has stated that we need to start instituting multiple strategies in order to identify and then correct the areas that need correction. They have recommended, and there currently are what they call maternal mortality review boards, where each and every maternal death is reviewed to look for the problem and to look for solutions. They've also advocated basically establishing things like best practices in certain clinical settings so that we can prevent these maternal deaths. And so these are all areas that need to be investigated. And there are lots of people currently working on this problem. What I really want to do today is provide food for thought. I don't have the answers, but I do have a hypothesis. about Black maternal mortality. And I believe that this hypothesis is applicable to other women. But as stated before, really am focusing on Black maternal mortality because of this large disparity. And I believe that with this hypothesis that we can see that there is action that can be taken on the individual level, among professionals, and with our government. So it's a puzzle. It's a puzzle, and we all agree that it's complicated, and we're trying to find answers. Couple things that we do know. We do know that there's an elevated rate of Black maternal mortality. When they looked at the primary causes, it appeared to be related to cardiovascular disease. Now, this is for Black women, slightly different for others, but for Black women, it seemed to be primarily cardiovascular disease, whether it was preeclampsia or elevated blood pressure that develops during the pregnancy, or chronic hypertension, which may have preceded the pregnancy. Cardiovascular disease seemed to be a significant factor. One of the other things which was identified as being a significant factor for African-American Black women was obesity. And so just in terms of medicine in general, we know that obesity is a factor in cardiovascular disease, which could be a reason for the increase in maternal mortality. But then the question is obesity the cause, or is obesity the symptom of yet another problem? And my hypothesis today is that obesity is the symptom of yet another underlying problem. And actually, there are two problems. One is chemicals called endocrine disruptive chemicals, and the other is ultra-processed foods. And I am suggesting that this is the basis for our problems. And if we could correct these two areas, then we could impact obesity and potentially lower the risk for maternal mortality. So starting with endocrine disruptive chemicals. Endocrine disruptive chemicals are used in the production of plastics. These chemicals help to change the properties of the plastic, the appearance of the plastic, and these chemicals are everywhere. I mean, it's almost frightening when you see the prevalence of these EDCs, chemicals in our environment. And the question is, how did this happen? How did we get to this point? And this is just a busy slide showing you that there are all different types of EDCs, endocrine disruptive chemicals. They're in our food preparations, they're in our pharmaceuticals, they're in our food packaging, they're in our clothing, they are everywhere. And this little box in the corner shows you the main primary manufacturers of chemicals. Now, why are these chemicals even a problem? By their name, endocrine disruptive chemicals means that they can act like or mimic hormones in our bodies. And as a result of that, they have the potential of disrupting, interfering, altering hormonal regulation. And we're talking about hormones such as estrogen, which is the predominant hormone produced by women. So these are significant. What we know is that unlike pharmaceuticals, which have the FDA oversight to try to ensure that the public is not being exposed to products that can cause harm, with EDCs, a lot of times these chemicals are used in the production of plastics and there's no regulation. And so we don't know the long-term or even the short-term effect of many of these chemicals. And there are many chemicals. Now, how did we get to be so dependent on plastics? Plastic actually is produced from waste product from the petroleum industry. And it turns out that plastic had two things that were wonderful about it. Plastic was relatively cheap to manufacture, and plastic was versatile. And as plastic became more prominent in our society, beginning again in the second half of the 20th century, we went from a society where things were reusable to a society where things became disposable, meaning that there used to be a milk bottle and the milkman would collect the milk bottle and they would be cleaned or sanitized or whatever, to now we just throw out the milk carton and plastics are used in the production of the milk cartons. It's significant that in 1978, Coca-Cola went from their glass bottles to the plastic bottles. And that was like a turning point. And currently it's estimated that annually 88 billion plastic Coca-Cola bottles are produced. And that's a hard number. That's a hard number to wrap your head around. 88 billion. Someone has said that if you line the bottles up end to end, you could string it to the moon and back 31 times. So that's a lot. And so now we have this throwaway society where we use things one time and then we dispose of it. And we have problems with accumulation, and we have problems with these chemicals that are used to produce the variety of plastics can then leach or get released into our food. We can inhale it, we can swallow it, we can put it on our skin. And the question is, what health risks do they generate? And we're just starting to appreciate that not only is there abundance of plastic in the ocean, in the fish, in the soil, but we also harbor or contain plastics within our body. Just to go on a little bit about this, it's become what they call an invisible danger. We are starting to suspect that these EDCs, these chemicals, can affect children, that they can affect women, and they can affect men in a variety of ways. What we've also have seen, and this is pretty astounding, that 50% of all the plastics were produced, more than 50%, I should say, of all the plastics ever produced have been made since 2000. And it's projected that this number will increase. And so we are swimming in plastics. And now we're seeing that plastics can have the potential to affect our health. And there's the concern that women may actually be at an increased risk for this because obviously we carry the pregnancies, and there has been reports of following women who have a high intake of plastics and looking and seeing elevated levels of plastics in the umbilical cord. We've seen that some of these plastics have been related to other gynecological issues like infertility and fibroid tumors. We know that a number of the feminine hygiene products can contain plastics, which means if they're in our body or opposed to our skin, that they can be introduced into our systems. And probably the most frightening to me is that not only does it have the potential to affect the mother, it has the potential to affect our children, our unborn children. And that's the part where the various medical societies are starting to appreciate that we need to pay more attention to this concern. It has been suggested by the American College of OBGYN that OBGYNs should take the time and discuss and review with their patients environmental hazards, environmental risk factors. But in practicum, what's been seen that only about 45% of OBGYNs have the time or opportunity to talk about the risk of mercury. About 20% will talk to pregnant women about pesticides and insecticides. Maybe 5 to 10% will talk to women about EDC, such as phthalates or BPA, and who knows how many have the opportunity or the information to talk to women about an EDC, which is called an obesogen, and how that could potentially affect women. Part of this is because this information is newly evolving, but who is going to explain this to the OBGYN? And how is the pregnant mother going to know what she needs to do or how she can avoid if it's everywhere? I mean, so these are really huge questions that we need to consider. And even when we are trying to do the right thing, it has been shown that there are what they call microplastics within our plastic water bottles. And that when we buy a bottle of water that's in a plastic container, there is a good likelihood that we are also swallowing microplastics. Now, what's not known is whether these microplastics will just get eliminated from our bodies as they travel through our digestive system, or do they get absorbed into our bloodstream? And if once they're absorbed into our bloodstream, then it's the potential for them to go to various organs in our body. I mean, so this is clearly an area that requires more research, more investigation, more just public awareness. And it's overwhelming. It's really overwhelming to think about, because this busy slide is only partially representative of all the different sources of these endocrine disruptive chemicals. They're in the water, as just discussed. They're in our cosmetics. They're in canned and the pesticides used on conventional foods. They're in our feminine hygiene products. They're in our hair care products. And they've been identified in our fast foods and our ultra processed foods. One of the reasons that this is germane to Black women, it's that it's well documented that Black women have the largest market share in terms of hair care products. And when they look at the use of fast food restaurants, Black women among women have the highest rate of going to a fast food, which means that there is the real possibility that Black women are being exposed to a disproportionate amount of these EDCs. And why that's important, I'll try to tie this all together in a little bit. In terms of the fast food, we know that over $200 billion is spent on fast foods in a year in the United States. We like our fast foods. 80% say that they've gone to at least one fast food outlet, and the number one being McDonald's, at least once a month. 20% say they've eaten fast food, or they eat fast food at least once a week. 23% say that they have it at least 3 or more times per week, and lunch seems to be the most popular time. And 34% of children say that they are eating fast foods on a daily basis. Which brings me to that second component, which is ultra-processed foods. And I have to go back in terms of just giving a little history. Ultra-processed foods is part of a food classification system. The NOVA food classification has 4 groups, and the 4th group is ultra-processed foods. As a background, I should say that this NOVA food classification system was developed in Brazil. Brazil is a developing country, but they realized that the main diseases affecting Brazilians were no longer acute, like infection, but chronic, like hypertension and diabetes. And the Ministry of Health developed a new food classification along with guidelines to give to Brazilians to help to improve the health of the country. And this new food classification system was called NOVA. And as stated before, it divides the foods into 4 distinct categories, not determined by nutrients or not determined by calories, but rather determined based on the amount of food processing that was required in order to get that particular food item. So briefly, the 4 groups. Group 1, unprocessed or minimally processed foods. Something like that would be a fruit or vegetable taken from a garden, or nuts without seeds, or dried or fresh herbs. Examples of unprocessed or minimally processed foods. Group 2 are what are called processed culinary ingredients. There are things like olive oil, which is derived from olives, or salt, which is extracted. And these ingredients are then added to the processed foods. Processed foods, I'm sorry, let me back that up. I think that wasn't absolutely clear. So group one, unprocessed or minimally processed foods. Group two is really talking about culinary ingredients, which are extracted from natural foods like olive oil or syrup from a maple tree. And these ingredients are often used in homes and restaurants to season our foods and to create that variety of ethnic foods that we can all appreciate. Group three are processed foods that are manufactured by an industry that are then incorporated into foods in group one and group two. And examples of processed foods in group three would be something like canned tuna fish or tomato paste or a fruit in a sugar syrup. And this is produced by an industry, but it is food that uses one or two ingredients as opposed to what we call the ultra-processed foods. Ultra-processed foods are basically concoctions or formulations that take extracts from foods and they take food constituents and they put them together to create a number of products. And these products are have added ingredients like emulsifiers and other ingredients, food colors and flavors are added to this. And it's a multi-step process. Ultra-processed foods are not something that you can make at home. For instance, you can take a potato and you can make French fries, but you can't make a Dorito in your kitchen. This is an example of an ultra-processed food. So a lot of the carbonated soft drinks, or all of the carbonated soft drinks, the energy drinks, the sports drinks, the sweetened juices, the fish sticks, the nuggets, the hot dogs, these are ultra-processed foods. And so the Brazilian government created this food system, and their golden rule to their citizens was always prefer natural or minimally processed foods and freshly made dishes and meals, and avoid ultra-processed foods. Now, what I like about that is it's simple. It's simple. It's easy to remember. You want to avoid ultra-processed foods, and you want to focus on the natural and minimally processed. So in this diagram, you can see examples of what might be considered processed, and also what might be considered ultra-processed foods. I'm contrasting that with the dietary guidelines for Americans for 2020, from 2020 to 2025. And there were several key steps that were advised, and they were that Americans should follow a healthy dietary pattern at every stage of life, that we should customize and enjoy nutrient-dense food and beverage choices to reflect personal preferences and cultural traditions, along with budgetary considerations. We should focus on meeting food group needs with nutrient-dense foods and beverages and stay within calorie limits, and that we should limit foods and beverages higher in added sugars, saturated fat, sodium, and limit alcohol beverages. There is no distinct reference to ultra-processed foods. So here's yet another way to tell if it's an ultra-processed food. Look at the ingredients. The saying, "I bet you can't eat just one," is very real because these foods are manufactured in such a way as to be cheap, very tasty, convenient, have a long shelf life, and be ready to eat, meaning there's minimal preparation required on your part for this to have this food. They also, it's because it's easy and rarely available and you don't really have to do it, you can eat these things while watching TV or being distracted on a phone. So you don't even appreciate how much you're actually eating. So the question is, these foods are cheap often, and that's a really important point when you're talking up to women in the workforce who may not be making as much money as men, but that need to feed families. The ability of it being cheap, readily accessible, minimal preparation, long shelf life are all appealing characteristics. But unfortunately, there's a lot of sugar in this, and we know that sugar has been associated with many negatives such as weight gain, obesity, diabetes, elevated triglyceride levels, hypertension, heart disease. We know that. And so there have been studies that have shown that in this country, the top 3 ultra-processed foods are breads, cakes, cookies, and pies are grouped together, and salty snacks. Now, of these ultra-processed foods, the foods that have the highest sugar content are the carbonated soft drinks, the fruit flavor, pre-sweetened tea, coffee, energy, sports drinks, and the cakes, pies, and cookies. We know that in the United States, it's been said that almost 90%, 89.7% of the added sugars that we eat come from ultra-processed foods. So now the hypothesis. The hypothesis is that plastics release the EDCs, and the EDCs are everywhere, but they're in our food. And there are EDCs that are called obesogens, which actually increase our propensity to be obese. And we know that the ultra processed foods have increased levels of added sugar, which increases obesity, which increases our risk for cardiovascular disease, which could increase our risk for maternal mortality. And this is a particular risk for pregnant women at risk. And who are the pregnant women at risk? These are pregnant women who, based on their socioeconomic situation, based on their ethnicity, based on their race, based on inherent racism, may actually be at an increased risk for the effect of too many plastics, exposures of too many plastics, and too much ultra-processed foods, which is contributing to the maternal mortality that we see. It's estimated that obesity adds at least another $200 billion to our US healthcare cost. And so it's kind of mind-boggling in that, could the answer be this simple? That what we need to do, we need to re-educate women, professionals, to the wisdom of natural and minimally processed foods. We know that these are not simple solutions, and I am not suggesting that it's easy, but we need to start somewhere. We need fiscal policies, maybe. We need to start taxing sugary drinks. We need warning labels put on the front of packages, potentially to let people know this is an ultra-processed food. We need to look at the food industry and see how we can reduce marketing of junk food and sugary drinks to our children and adolescents. We need to restrict the ultra-processed foods, the junk, the sugary choices that are in our school meal programs. We need to target and give subsidies and incentives to having healthy food options in grocery stores in underserved areas. It's been documented that there's a higher percentage of fast food eateries in Black communities compared to non-Black communities. It's been shown that we can make a difference, and that we need to give people options and not have them live in what's been classified as food deserts. And we need to consider as a society, as a government, as individuals, as citizens, whether we want to subject food industries and beverages to a certain degree of regulation because of the concerns that we are experiencing as a result of what we are exposed to and what we're eating. And so that's it. I mean, that's my conversation. And the question is the US failing women? And I think that the answer is yet to be determined. I think for a lot of us, we are just understanding the magnitude of the problem, and that once we can see the magnitude of the problem, then we will start to identify areas that we can improve. And clearly, what I suggested was just my hypothesis, but we need more research. We need to figure out, is there any validity to what's been said and what can we do? And then the last thing I'd like to show is that for those that are interested in reading more or learning more, because I don't necessarily feel that I've done it full justice, highly recommended read the Plastic Atlas, the food guide from the Ministry of Health in Brazil, and the Endocrine Society has put out Plastics, EDCs, and Health. And so people are aware. We just need to do better. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Rahman, for that very valuable and priceless information that you have given us today with your presentation. But before we open up with our Q&A session, if anyone wants to follow up with you or find any information about you, what's the best way to do that?
Oh, the best way is to send me an email at mail, M-A-I-L, at drrahman.com, and doctor is spelled out. So it's DOCTORRAHMAN.com.
Thanks for sharing that. And now we're ready to open up our live Q&A session. But first, just want to explain to everyone how we do this on our end. We normally don't take questions from the chat, and instead we ask everyone to virtually raise your hand. If you're not sure how to do this, all you have to do is go to your Zoom window, go on the bottom, you see the reactions tab, you click that, and then you should see a raise hand function in that menu. Click that raise hand function, and then we'll see your hand raised in our participants section. And we basically take the questions in the order in which we receive them. So when it is your turn, we'll unmute you and prompt you to ask your question. And with that, let's get started. So let's see. We have first question is Bin. Bin, what's your question?
Yeah, hello, good morning. And thank you for your time to teach us. My question is, you had the best food is eat the natural fermented food. What's the food? What's that? What is the natural fermented food?
So again, referring back to the NOVA food classification, Group 1 or natural foods, something directly from nature, an apple that's removed from a tree, a produce that's pulled from the ground. That's a natural or minimally processed food. Those are also the foods that tend to have the most nutrients in them. And so you want to focus on anything that is basically from nature, and then minimally processed, meaning that you could add some olive oil, you could add some salt to your meal, but you're not eating an ultra processed foods that has X number of chemicals in it to increase the shelf life. If something can stay in your kitchen and on your shelf for a year, I don't know how healthy that is for you, because there has to be ingredients in that thing to increase its shelf life. We know that the food industry will manipulate and manufacture taste so that we keep wanting it. And so those are the kind of things that we want to avoid. We want to avoid ultra processed foods. And we want to focus, what it is? It's the home cooked meal. It's what people will probably be doing a lot of during this holiday season when they come together for their religious celebrations, and they're in their homes and they're sharing meals that they've prepared in their own homes. That's the ideal situation, and not McDonald's.
All right, thank you, Ben, for that. Next, we have Alejandro. Alejandro, what is your question?
Hello.
Hello.
Hi, thank you for the great presentation. And I found it very simple and easy to understand. And the simplicity is very nice. Makes it, I think, for the average viewer to be able to connect more with what you're talking about and maybe hopefully take action a little bit easier. Thanks for your time with us. I've been in the field of nutrition for a while now, and I've come to realize the connection between vitamin D levels, and heart health. I think you touched on the heart health aspect of your presentation a little bit, But I guess I wondering if you have any more insight on correlation between vitamin D levels, melanin, and the skin, so skin tone, and then where this might have played a factor in some of the disparities that we've seen.
Yes, I will answer your question with a very circuitous answer in that I am a gynecologist, and one of my interests has been fibroid tumors, because we know that fibroid tumors occur globally. We don't know why. We know that African American have a higher risk of symptomatic fibroid tumors, and as a result, end up with more surgical procedures. And so the question was, why? Why is that? And one of the potential treatments for fibroids was correction of a vitamin D deficiency. And what we've come to realize is that vitamin D has wonderful properties and has many functions in our body. And there had even been reports that suggested that if you corrected the vitamin D deficiency in women, you either reduced or slowed down the growth of their fibroid tumors. And so I was very excited about that because I was just frustrated that women only seemed to be offered surgical solutions, whereas there were others who, in other fields, that were clearly identifying that food made a difference, meaning that there are doctors that are reversing cardiovascular disease through food, and that there are doctors who have corrected or reduced the likelihood of cancer through food. And the question is, why not with something so prevalent and so symptomatic as fibroid tumors? And so that's actually how I became interested in vitamins and nutrition and starting to see food as really seeing food as medicine, and I think that was a real shift for me. Always thought eating well made sense, but to actually see that food as medicine. And so I have been humbled, and I'm finally getting to the answer of your question, by the fact that it's not as simple as we sometimes make it seem. And so there are a lot of interactions that occur within the body as an ingestion of what we eat. And so I tend to now side with the thought that it's not necessarily an individual vitamin or supplement, it's good food. And within that good food, there will be an abundance of nutrients, and how they interact and play together. We don't really have a good understanding of that. And so my answer to your question is, I don't have a lot to say about the benefit of vitamin D. I would rather people focus on the benefit of eating well.
Agreed. Thank you. Yeah, that's great. I'm definitely, being in my old health journey, I definitely can share that same belief. And thank you for that insight, though, as far as a gynecologist. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Alejandro, for that. Thank you, Dr. Rahman. It looks like we don't have any hands raised yet. Let me just explain to people who haven't, who just maybe came into this meeting. All you have to do is basically go to your reactions tab at the bottom of the Zoom window, and then hit the reactions tab. And there's a raise hand function there where you can click it, and then we'll see you in the participants window. So, and looks like we have another person. Okay, we have Donna. Donna, what's your question for Dr. Rahman?
Can you hear me?
Yep, we hear you loud and clear.
Okay, my question is, if we are to get our nourishment from food, what about the food that's grown in depleted soils? How do you respond to that?
That's a good question, because in researching this, we know that plastics are not only in the water, but plastics are in our soil, and that affects our crops and the development and the nutrient dense properties of the food that we are exposed to. And so that's a real risk. I say that's where we need more study and more intervention. I mean, does it mean that in addition to eating well and eating minimally processed foods, we still need to add supplements? That might be it. Or do we get a sufficient amount with what we have? I don't know where we stand on that. I don't know how deficient our foods are. And so it's hard to make a determination of what's needed if we don't know what we're dealing with.
Thank you for that, Donna. Next, we have Janet. Janet, what is your question for Dr. Rahman?
Hi, thank you for your great presentation. I'm in the suburbs of Chicago area. I teach cooking classes, plant-based. And my question to you is, I come across some people in conversation that don't, they're eating fast food, they don't cook at home. What, in your experience, do you find is the entry point to speaking to people that are eating the fast food American diet, to get them aware and interested that there is another way? You don't have to be sick and unhealthy, and it is the food. Most people, when they first hear it, they can't believe it. The second thing is they think it's too expensive to cook at home and too much time. The normal excuses we get. What do you find with your patients are some key things that you help them with, so we all could, in the audience, help others try the plant-based diet and eating more vegetables? What have you had success with?
Success is a relative term. I think clearly it's challenging. I mean, I think there's such an emotional component to food that it's hard to change people's minds about food. Also, I was trying to earlier show that there is a setup which almost makes it easier for me, if I'm a busy mom, to gravitate towards the ultra processed foods, because they're easy, they're quick, they're ready to eat, or all I have to do is heat it up. And so it takes away some of the time. And at times they can be cheaper. Ramen noodles might be a lot cheaper than actually cooking something, and so it becomes hard, and it's difficult to wag your finger at that mom who's trying to do the best that she can with the little that she has. And so that's why I was trying to bring in, it's not just food, it's economics, it's a setup, or if she has to travel miles to a grocery store and there's a convenience store right on the corner, there's a disincentive. But all of that being said, I think the time that you have the greatest impact on a woman is when she's pregnant. I think that what she wouldn't do for herself, she would consider doing for her child. And if she can see that there's a clear benefit or a clear risk to her child to do otherwise, that's an incentive. But I think a bigger problem is that if you don't know how to cook, if you don't know anything about seasoning, it's just a lot easier to put something in a microwave. And so I think that there's just a number of places where there needs to be adjustments along the way. But the problem is not to point the finger at the mom that's or the person that refuses. I think that once we get an education and once we see a benefit, then we don't have to do a lot of persuading for others to change.
Thank you. So you're saying the focus should be moms. I think if I would have known this when I was a young mom, I would have definitely done this, but it's getting to the moms at that level. Yeah.
And it's also not only how do you cook, but how do you meal prep? How do you shop for a bargain? How do you plan a meal so that you don't need to run to the store? I mean, there's some real there used to be home ec. There's no home ec anymore, right?
Exactly. So we need to teach people the home ec basics.
Oh, there needs, and not just for women, but for everybody. We need to know that you can eat well on a limited budget, if you know how to do it, how to shop for a bargain, how to, prepare in advance. So you're not necessarily needing to cook every night. Bringing your kids into that process so that they can see and learn and benefit from it. I think there's just a lot that needs to be done, and some of it is truly basic.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for that, those comments. I appreciate that.
Thanks, Janet. All right. Also, I want to ask a question, Sharon. I just want to add to Janet's question. What's the best advice you can give to people who live in food deserts, where they don't have easy, accessible, nutritious food available to them? What's the best advice you can give to those individuals?
That's hard. You want to find out if there are local communities that sometimes grow vegetables. You want to make them aware of those things, but then it's like, well, what am I going to do with this squash? Or how do I fix this squash? So it just leaves a lot of, the more you do, the more you see needs to be done, and so you need to, does it make sense for me to say you need to get on a bus and travel into another neighborhood and buy this food when you don't necessarily have the fare to do that? And then you don't know what to do with the food once you get it. And so there are just many things that need to happen along the way. But if that would reduce exposure to EDCs, if that would lower the problem with obesity, that might be what's needed in order to reduce maternal mortality. And so I guess if we can make a clear, if that becomes clear, and if that is actually confirmed, because again, this is my hypothesis. If that can be confirmed, then we need to redirect some of our energy, not just in looking at what happened at the delivery and why things went wrong, but what could we have done prenatally to to optimize this pregnancy? And I'm saying food is right there at the top.
Thank you so much for that, Doctor. Next, we have Jessica. Jessica, what is your question?
Can you hear me?
Yeah, we hear you.
Okay, great. Wow, it's the first time I've ever called on this show, on this conference. I'm calling from Houston, Texas, barbecue capital of the world. But anyway, what we called to say was we're really enjoying your presentation. And as an older African-American woman, we appreciate the real truth about health conference, having you here, and hope that it can benefit other ethnicities also. And I don't really have any particular questions, but my sister used to have fibroids, but as she got older, somehow they disappeared or something. But how we could have helped her? I'm plant-based myself personally. Is there a way to help a person that's primarily plant-based that you know of, that you experiment with?
So
Thank you.
fibroids are fascinating. Again, not enough research has been done with fibroids, but what we know about fibroids is that they become prevalent during a woman's reproductive years, and that's when her estrogen levels are high. When she starts to go through the change and her estrogen level starts to decline, fibroids don't have as much to feed off of. They tend to get smaller and become asymptomatic. Now, tying that back into EDCs, if you have EDCs that mimic estrogen, and you are a woman that, for whatever reason, is being exposed to increased levels of these EDCs, you may inadvertently be feeding your fibroid tumors, which is why maybe Black women tend to be more symptomatic with fibroid tumors. And so what you do will depend on a number of things. It depends on at what age do you become symptomatic? Are you still at an age where you want to have children, or are you closer to menopause? And then all the options start to change. But clearly, anything that could limit your estrogen will limit the feeding of your fibroid. And I do want to say that one of the doctors that I really respect is Dr. Baxter Montgomery. He's a cardiologist in Houston, and he's a plant-based cardiologist in Houston, which is a real
we
challenge.
know him. We know him.
And his
He's very good.
ability, to reverse cardiovascular disease is nothing short of impressive.
Thank you.
All right, looks like there's no more hands up. I just want to let everyone know, it's a great opportunity to ask Dr. Rahman any question you have. Let me reiterate, basically to raise your hand, all you have to do is click your reactions tab at the bottom of the Zoom window. You hit the raise hand icon, and that we will see a raise hand in our window. And seeing no one yet. All right, aside from that, Dr. Rahman, do you have anything to add?
No, happy holidays to everyone.
Okay.
Eat well, enjoy your family. It's a holy month. We should take the time to consider our blessings.
All right, great. So what I'll do is thank you, Dr. Rahman, for your time. It was a pleasure having you here. Thank you for all the questions that you've answered with us. What I'm going to do is I'm going to unmute everyone in this audience. So everyone, we have to say for Dr. Rahman. You have it. There you go.
Thank you, Dr.
Rahman. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Doctor. We appreciate it.
Appreciate it.